Friends and colleagues, it gives me great pleasure to call once more on the representative from Arizona, Ryan Shaw, to introduce and to moderate our final session of the day. Thanks very much, Ryan.
Thank you, Craig. What a great day it's been, and now we find ourselves at the very last panel. Thank you all for your perseverance and endurance, though I know the quality of conversation has made it all very worthwhile so far. We started the day with a panel featuring two very distinguished Peters, and it's only fitting that we conclude the day in the same way, so it's my honor to introduce Peter Dutton and Peter Jones. I've promised to keep these introductions short because these two are a wealth of information on their chosen topic of comparing maritime capabilities between the Chinese and the AUKUS. And so without further ado, Peter Dutton is a researcher on China's maritime expansion, on Chinese views of sovereignty and other matters shaping Chinese ascendance. He serves as the interim dean of the Center for Naval Warfare Studies at the U.S. Naval War College, formerly as director of the China Maritime Studies Institute. He served as a judge advocate in the U.S. Navy, and as a product of the Plus Alliance, he has a PhD from King's College London. We will also consider Peter Jones a product of the Plus Alliance, although this might have predated the alliance itself, because he has both a BA and an MA from the University of New South Wales. He joined the Royal Australian Navy in 1974, serving with honor and distinction at every rank, including as Maritime Interception Operations Screen Commander in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Do I have that right, sir? All right. In 2011, he was promoted to Vice Admiral, and both, yes. I was really grateful that my major speaking event this morning was before the jet lag kicked in, and you're just going to have to tolerate me at this stage. Okay. In 2011, he was promoted to Vice Admiral and Chief of the Capability Development Group, at that time the second most senior officer in the Royal Australian Navy. He was made an officer in the Order of Australia, and Admiral Jones is president of the Australian Naval Institute and adjunct professor in the Naval Studies Group here at UNSW Canberra. All correct? Good for me. Okay, so without further ado, to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Before we begin, I have two things to say. The first is, if you are expecting a former defense minister and found that you were sold a bill of goods and got a professor from the U.S. Naval War College, you have 30 seconds amnesty to leave the room. Feel free. The second is, I do work for the United States government, so everything I say from now on is my own personal opinions and not the perspectives of the United States government. So we're going to talk together, I think. Share the microphone. Come on up. We were given a pretty tall order, frankly, which is to compare the strengths and weaknesses of the PLA Navy with the AUKUS Navies. I'll do the PLA side, you'll do the AUKUS Navy side, and we'll see what we come up with in this format.
Okay, that sounds good, Pete. And one thing you may, looking at Peter, think he's Californian. He's actually not. He just flew with Qantas, and he just didn't. His luggage didn't come with him.
Nope. But I am the most comfortable guy in the room.
You are. You are, that's true. Okay, we've got the thing. So what we plan to do is we're going to look at the capabilities of the AUKUS Navies and the PLA Navy through the Australian lens of the fundamental inputs of capability. Now, for the Australians, you'll know that that is quite lengthy. So what we've done to save you is we've actually reduced it. So we're going to look at the navies from the force structure, including people, command and control and organisation, industrial support base, and then we'll make some sort of judgments. In fact, we'll make judgments along the way. So over to you, Pete.
Yeah, there's a couple of important caveats that I think we need to discuss before we actually get into our major presentation, which is that what we're really talking about isn't a Navy versus Navy problem. We've been asked to compare them, and we will. But what we're talking about is a military system versus a military system option or issue. So that's the first. Comparison of either the total number of ships, for instance, or the total tonnage is really problematic in understanding the overall capabilities of navies to fight, particularly each other. Many factors are involved in these determinations, some of which we're going to address below. The second issue is very often comparing one state's navy to another misses that point entirely, as I started to say. Often a better comparison is to assess what military assets one state can bring to bear to achieve its objective in relation to its opponent's available military assets to stop it. Right? So it's much more than naval capability that those systems that we're talking about here. So in the case of a Taiwan Strait scenario, for instance, the elephant in the room, much of China's air, missile, and naval forces and a substantial portion of its ground, space, and cyber forces are designed to work together to establish sanctuary for mainland forces to project power across the Taiwan Strait by denying access to any potential intervening power, such as the United States. On the other hand, the tyranny of distance and global commitments limit at least the American capacity, but also AUKUS partners can bring to bear in that same scenario. So this illustrates the limits of a Navy-to-Navy comparison. Nonetheless, we're going to do this because we think it can shed some light on the trends, that's important, and on how states might fare in a contest over purely naval missions, such as, for instance, control of sea line communications across the Indian Ocean. So first of all, the PLA Navy force structure. Here is what we're actually talking about when we're talking about the PLA. There really are four primary missions of navies. We need to start there because if you're going to compare the navies, you have to compare what they can accomplish in accordance with these missions. The four are sea control, power projection, naval presence or naval diplomacy, and strategic deterrence. These are the four missions of any Navy, and they're designed around the missions that the state has for its own Navy. They're all very different. So there are many definitions of sea control, but this is an important one that we have to talk about because it's a very important component of how the PLA Navy is developed. A useful shorthand definition of sea control might be when a force creates circumstances in a maritime context in which the stronger side carries out its main operational task in terms of time and place without significant challenge from its opponent. Okay, so it's that two systems that I was talking about. This may include the safe movement of ground forces and supplies, the protection of shipping, or the denial to the enemy of the use of the seas to achieve his own objective. Sea control is not an end in itself, but is achieved to assert another operational objective. Often that objective is to project power ashore, as in the PLA's need to project power into Taiwan. With this in mind, we can assess fundamentally that the PLA Navy is largely structured as a sea control force to support the overall PLA mission to achieve regional sea control in East Asia at will. It's important to recognize that the PLA Navy, as I said, is but one part of this overall anti-access area denial system. Secondarily, the PLA Navy is increasingly structured to develop sea lane security. I want to make that clear. Secondarily, structured to develop sea lane security, especially in the broader Indo-Pacific, and to conduct global naval diplomacy. The PLA Navy has increasingly capable power projection platforms and weapons, but is limited beyond the regional context by a lack of available bases from which to project power during times of crisis and conflict. This limits the range of sea control and power projection missions currently available to the PLA Navy, especially in contested waters. The PLA Navy also seeks to develop and expand its strategic deterrence capability, but yet cannot be considered a capable force in this regard. So these are some of the upfront assessments before we get into the details. In terms of the overall size, the battle force fleet of the PLA Navy surpassed that of the U.S. Navy in 2015. Let that sink in. Today, the PLA Navy is the largest battle force Navy in the world with approximately 355 major combatants, including the surface combatants. I won't go through them all in detail, but China had 88 major surface combatants in 2015. And in 2021, possessed 131 major surface combatants. Now, this is their cruisers, destroyers, frigates, and corvettes. Key classes include the Renhai Air Defense and ASW cruiser destroyer, the Luoyang 2 Type 05D. You might have heard of that in the news over the last 24 hours, as it has now become encroaching. It was a Luoyang 2 that encroached on the inside the 24 nautical miles of Taiwan just recently. The Zhangkai 2, 30 Zhangkai 2 frigates, and 72 Zhangdao corvettes or light frigates. So the overall composition of the force makes it a potent sea control force, designed to be a strong component of China's anti-access area denial system, military system, to support sea control in East Asia and increasingly SLOC security in the region farther from China's shores. All of these vessels can support China's naval diplomacy missions as well, but they can only do so in peacetime. The submarines, of course, China possesses primarily a diesel submarine fleet, 55 diesel submarines in 2020. This is primarily a sea control, a local sea control mission in East Asia. China is increasing its submarine force, but not rapidly. This is a really important point. Not rapidly increasing the size of its sea control submarine force. It now possesses 6 SSBNs, up from 4 2 years ago, with 8 planned by 2030. These are the nuclear attack submarines. And this indicates a potential future power projection role, but it's expected to grow modestly in size over the decade, but China's submarine force is expected to improve in quality as older vessels are replaced with more capable ones. I'm sure you've heard about the aircraft carrier program that the Chinese have developed. Currently they possess 2 conventionally powered sort of ski ramp style aircraft carriers that are between 60 and 70,000 tons. These are about 2/3 of the size of American aircraft carriers. The newest one, the third in line, will be about 100,000 tons, roughly the size of an American carrier, and will possess, it's due to enter service by 2024, and will possess catapults, and they'll probably be electromagnetic catapults, which is the state of the art that the Ford-class carrier is working with now. The carrier is expected to employ the latest aircraft, the J-35, very formidable fighters, and reportedly an airborne early warning aircraft is under development. So this is a power projection and sea control system off of an aircraft carrier. This capability will mark a significant step in the development of the PLA Navy's power projection and naval diplomacy capabilities, especially since we believe that the 4th naval carrier will probably be nuclear powered, and that is under development now. Major amphibious ships, they have a major amphibious ship program as well. These, of course, will be very useful during a Taiwan Strait scenario. However, overall, we think that even though they're developing a Marine Corps, China currently lacks sufficient amphibious lift, logistics, and material capability for this amphibious fleet to be the backbone or to be the complete force that projects power across the Taiwan Strait. What we're observing is the increasing use of civilian vessels for this purpose, roll-on, roll-off vessels, ROROs, and other types of ferries, for instance, that could be used once sanctuary is developed in the waters between the mainland and Taiwan. So what the amphibious vessels are currently used for are protecting China's overseas interests through power projection and naval diplomacy, and of course also for a Taiwan Strait scenario. I want to touch briefly on a few other things. you cannot deal with the entire PLA Navy force structure in this session, but talking a little bit about mine warfare is important. China has 55 to 60. It's hard for me to pin down that number from open source material, but between 55 and 60 active mine vessels right now that operate across the mine missions, dedicated to both mine laying, mine hunting, mine sweeping. And they have a significant number of inactive in operational reserve as well. And then additionally, Chinese naval auxiliaries that are quite formidable underway replenishment vessels. And this underway replenishment of naval capability is really important, and the Chinese have trained to make it important as well. It is the first capability that ship commanders are required to have the capacity to do as they are going through a training cycle. So there are a number of these, and they are quite advanced vessels. You see the Type 091 fast combat support ships. The PLA currently only has 2, but they're substantial and significant vessels. They have 4 general stores replenishment vessels, and 9 or perhaps 10 replenishment oilers, depending on how they're counted. Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about land-based naval air. They have, the Chinese possess the H-6J bomber, which can carry up to 6 supersonic YJ-18 anti-surface cruise missiles each. The missile has a maximum range of about 290 miles. And then also the Y-8 anti-submarine warfare aircraft, which is a component of the ASW shield that the PLA Navy has developed to protect China's periphery. So from its current level of approximately 155 vessels, the PLA Navy's overall battle force is expected to grow to 420 ships by 2025. It's on track to go from currently 155 to 420 by 2025, and 460 ships by the end of this decade. And this does not include the current 85 littoral patrol craft that the Chinese possess that are ASCM-capable platforms. So China is quickly closing the gap in all of its areas of deficiency related to its primary mission, which is to develop sea control around Taiwan to create sanctuary for forces to flow from the mainland across to Taiwan itself. That means that the Chinese strengths are, I would say, are in regional sea control. They have significant strengths there. Their strengths include presence and naval diplomacy on a global basis. And third, I don't have time to talk about it, but what is often referred to as the gray zone, which is the lower level capabilities that China uses to sort of consolidate its expansion of the maritime area within China's First Island Chain perimeter. What are their weaknesses? Sea control beyond regional waters is a weakness today, but that's improving. They do have good underway replenishment capability, but what they don't have is overseas bases for sustainment and mutual support. This is something to pay careful attention to, how the Chinese are advancing political relationships with other countries that would give them not only access rights for underway or for local logistical replenishment, but also increasingly close political ties that could eventually become basing rights. That's a significant issue, still a Chinese weakness. I would say power projection is a weakness. The aircraft carriers currently still have significant limitations. They are a new platform for China. It's a very challenging mission to put together, but they are actually moving fast on it. Jointness and joint logistics is still something that they're working on. It is not yet a strength, it is a weakness. I would say strategic nuclear deterrence, the underwater part of a triad, it continues to be something of a weakness for China. And then there's some debates about anti-submarine warfare, long-range targeting, training, that's a significant one, and lack of combat experience are all areas that some people point to as weaknesses. Sir.
Thanks, Pete. Okay, so now turning to the three maritime forces of Australia, UK and the US. As you see from that slide, the total forces amount to 94 submarines, 14 aircraft carriers and around 220 major surface warships. In addition, of course, there's a sizeable AUKUS air forces, which have the ability to operate in the Indo-Pacific in support of land and maritime forces. The US has the 5th, the 7th and the 11th Air Forces in theatre, and for its part, the Royal Australian Air Force has probably one of the most modern air fleets of any air force in the world. And importantly, its key reconnaissance, strike and fighter aircraft are all used to operating in the maritime environment. The US Navy, while not now numerically the world's biggest navy, is unquestionably its most powerful. Its strength is in the number and quality of its submarines, its aircraft carriers, destroyers, the amphibious force, of course with the US Marine Corps integrated, and a very comprehensive afloat support force. The future shape of the US Navy has for some years been uncertain as Navy's requirements have been adjusted and also successive administrations have adjusted their approach. The Chief of Naval Operations Navigation Plan 2022 calls for a fleet of, I'll just go back, for 373 manned ships and about 150 large unmanned surface ships. So of that, there's a dozen nuclear ballistic missile submarines, 66 nuclear-powered attack submarines, and these are really considered the most capable attack submarines in the world. A dozen nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Once again, they're the premier aircraft carriers at sea, and they've been strengthened by the addition of the Joint Strike Fighter squadrons. There's 17 cruisers which are being phased out. There will be a bit of a capability gap, which will be in part covered by the destroyer force until the new DDG-X enters service from 2028. There's 73 destroyers, 3 which are the Zumwalt class and the rest the Arleigh Burke. Frigates will return to the US fleet from 2026 with the first of 20 Constellation class frigates. There's 22 littoral control ships or combat ships, and some of those are already being phased out now. Just 8 mine countermeasures vessels, quite a large amphibious force, the best in the world, of over 30 large amphibious ships. And once again, the logistics force is probably the most comprehensive, or is the most comprehensive of any navy. And just looking at the 150 unmanned surface and underwater vessels, they're really going to help develop this distributed architecture that the US Navy have talked about. Some of these unmanned vessels will be up to 2,000 tonnes, and they'll carry land and anti-ship missiles. And in the near term, some of those will actually have a small number of crew. This will provide the Navy in the assessment of the CNO, Admiral Mike Gilday, with an ability to fight one adversary and keep another in check. More recent commentary has called for a Navy of about 500 ships to meet potential demands. In respect to the unmanned element, Admiral Gilday has been at pains to point out that really the Navy is still learning what is in the art of the possible. In terms of capability, US weapons and sensors are some of the most advanced in the world with a high level of networking. This is exemplified by the cooperative engagement capability, which can network air and surface ships into a highly integrated kill chain. Equally important is the lethality of weapon systems that have been developed and probably the most tested and evaluated of any weapons at sea. The US Defence Force arguably trains its personnel in the most comprehensive manner. System documentation, evaluation and development are also great strengths. Importantly, a byproduct of being a superpower Navy is the US Navy has a large cadre of people with operational experience, including combat operations. So turning to the Royal Navy, it's the 5th largest in the world. As you can see there, 4 nuclear ballistic missile submarines, 6 attack class, now 2 conventional powered conventional carriers, also equipped with the Joint Strike Fighter, 6 guided missile destroyers, 12 frigates with the first of 8 Type 26 frigates joining the first, the Glasgow, in 2026. There'll be 5 smaller Type 31s entering service from about 2030, and it's hoped that these will be combined with the later Type 32 to increase the force from 12 frigates to 18. There's 9 mine countermeasures vessels and about 26 patrol vessels and 2 large amphibious ships, also with a marine component. The Royal Navy is at first glance a European Navy, but its DNA is to be a global Navy. It's interesting that in the last Queen Elizabeth deployment, there was an appreciation by the senior leaders in that task group how, going back in the Pacific after so many years, that that they'd seen that a lot had changed over the decades where there was a sustained Royal Navy presence. So at the moment, the Royal Navy in the Indo-Pacific is trying to maintain a 2 patrol vessel deployment. In the future, those ships will be replaced by the Type 21 frigates. The greatest strength of the Royal Navy is its operational efficiency, as well as the well-founded nature of its ships and combat aircraft. The 2 aircraft carriers and the nuclear attack submarines provide a limited power projection capability. Its greatest weaknesses is combat weight, i.e. numbers, and the current economic difficulties which preclude any major expansion. And I guess the thing to watch is how many of these frigates will get produced. In particular, over the recent decades, as I mentioned, that destroyer and frigate force declined dramatically, and those numbers have reduced the ability to maintain presence in different parts of the world beyond the European waters, and also even just to maintain a robust carrier task group size. So turning to the Australian Navy, it is the 6th most capable Navy in the Indo-Pacific. Its ambitious plans looking forward with the acquisition of nuclear attack submarines would make it one of the most powerful navies globally. The RN's core capabilities are really the 6 columns to be replaced by the nuclear boats, 3 destroyers, 8 Anzacs to be replaced at this stage by the 9 Hunter class, its patrol boats to be replaced by larger offshore patrol vessels, and its 3 large amphibious ships. Its greatest strengths are its advanced weapons and sensors. Many, but not all, are of US origin. Notably, the Australian-designed CA radar in the Anzacs is world leading. Another strength is the high levels of training of its personnel. And one thing of note is with the Fleet Air Arm and the work that they're doing, where they've done a lot of experimentation with UAVs. They've now focused on the Sheeble Camcopter S-100 as its standard UAV, but also they're exploring with the US Navy having drones for sensors and for weapons to actually operate from the Seahawk Romeo helicopters. Having said this, the weaknesses of the Royal Australian Navy is its lack of organic fixed-wing air power, but this can be mitigated depending on the location of operations by the very high quality and modernity of the Royal Australian Air Force. The other weaknesses, and very much the elephant in the room, is the absence of a concrete plan to replace Collins class. While the capabilities of the nuclear boats are beyond dispute, the large demands on people and resources in the interim until those capabilities come into service, it's going to be a real challenge to mitigate both to find those resources and also to mitigate any adverse effects on the other capabilities, not only in the Navy but the rest of the ADF. And it's worth making a general observation about the AUKUS mine warfare capabilities, that they are inadequate in terms of offensive and defensive capabilities. But on the positive note, all the navies have tried to keep pace with where the technology is. The trick will be is when do you actually start to expending money on getting some of these assets in time for when you actually need them. Just want to turn to workforce. A challenge of the maritime forces of all AUKUS navies is recruitment and retention of a skilled workforce. Of the three navies, only the US Navy is exceeding its recruitment and retention targets, but that's not the complete picture. So, for example, there are about 9,000 empty billets at sea in the US Navy, and just recently the US Navy has increased its maximum recruitment age to 41 to help fill the numbers. The Royal Navy is within striking distance of its recruitment and retention targets, but retaining skilled personnel remains an ongoing challenge. All the navies are having to adjust their workforce to be able to operate and maintain new systems such as uninhabited air, surface and subsurface platforms. For the REN, the recruitment and retention issue is the most acute and is exacerbated by the need to grow its workforce by 7% annually for at least the next 4 years. This challenge is made harder by the still heterogeneous nature of the fleet's equipment, which places added training demands and silos some sailors to particular ship classes. To put the RN's challenge into context, this is only the second time since 1945 that it's had to try and grow in a substantial way and introduce new technologies. The last time was the introduction of the aircraft carriers. This required both technical assistance and loan of and transfer of large numbers of people from the Royal Navy, so we'll wait to see what happens in terms of the submarines. Substantial changes to recruitment, operational tempo, immigration policies, which we heard about earlier, training and remuneration will all likely to be needed to meet the REN's challenges. A re-establishment of civilian crewed Australian Fleet Auxiliary may be considered. Civilian crewing of some support ships has long been the practice of the other two AUKUS navies.
All right, so that's the hardware. What about the ability to employ the hardware? We thought we would look at the command and control structures of the two organizations. Beginning in 2004, under the guidance of the Central Military Commission, the PLA began what is, as yet, an incomplete reorganization to execute near seas defense and far seas protection as their strategy. This entailed major reforms, including improving the civilian party leaderships over the party's military component. It is a party army, after all. And the PLA's Joint Operations Command System. The key improvement to the Joint Operations Command System was the consolidation of what had been decentralized service component led systems into new theater commands, as the picture depicts here. Now, the Central Military Commission provides overall management, the theater commands conduct operations, and the services engage in force development and have subcomponents within the theater commands, very similar, frankly, to the American Regional Combatant Command System. The CMC retains, Central Military Commission retains control over nuclear and other strategic weapons, presumably through the Joint Staff Department and its Joint Operations Command Center. One of the driving factors of the PLA Navy's organizational reform was the commissioning of the first aircraft carrier in 2012. In terms of the organizational structure, emphasis and perhaps preparation for an increase in future naval far seas operations has led the PLA to direct a shift in the center of gravity to the south. That's a quote. This reflects the importance of the South China Sea as the avenue through which the PLA Navy must travel to conduct operations across the Indian Ocean and even to a certain extent in the Western Pacific. Much of the PLA Navy's infrastructure is on Hainan Island, and it's being upgraded and reorganized to accommodate and support China's aircraft carriers. Actually, the aircraft carrier strike group as an organization is being supported there. Although the PLA Navy has been conducting routine operations in the Gulf of Aden since December 2008, the PLA still has no joint command and control architecture for operations beyond the near seas. This is the structure of the theater command system. So overseas operations are still centrally controlled through command and control architecture that resides in the capital in Beijing. This is not sustainable in the long run. It cannot be the basis for a large expansion of China's overseas naval presence without some very significant change in their command structure. I would say the strengths of the PLA command and control system is in their theater level, the very focused theater level planning. You can understand that each theater has its own responsibilities in terms of defense of the national territory. And so that is a strength, that focused theater level joint planning and training and logistical support and operational command and control, all within interior lines. Second, I would say doctrinal discipline is a strength for the Chinese and how they go about their operations. And that strength includes ISR targeting and navigation technologies. Weaknesses, though, are inter-theater level joint planning, training and logistical support, et cetera, command and control, operational command and control. Inter-theater is all, at this point, a developing capability. Sometimes when you say weakness, it overstates it. These are evolving capabilities. Command and control of overseas operations, I think, is clearly a weakness because they could be rapidly overcome. Such a small centralized system could be rapidly overcome, especially if there's operations for extended periods or, in particular, in contested environments. I think also mission command, the concept of mission command is a weakness for the PLA. Whereas they have doctrinal discipline, they have the inability to move outside of that doctrinal approach to operations readily and easily. There's a lot of reasons for that we could talk about later, but delegated decision-making during crises or conflict is not something that we would expect to see.
So the AUKUS forces have some similarities in terms of their organisation and their command and control. The maritime forces are used to operating in a networked environment with sister Army and Air Force assets, as well as a range of allies and an increasing range of coalition partners. They are able to operate in task groups for long deployments. President Biden reinforced the US approach to this in the recently released National Security Strategy 2022, where the principles of integrated deterrence were outlined. And the key components of that were integration across domains, integration across regions, integration across the spectrum of conflict, integration across the US government, and integration with allies and partners. Notably, in that national security strategy, it talks about the need to outcompete China and to constrain Russia. At the strategic and operational level, the AUKUS nations are inherently joint and also have close relations with other national security and intelligence agencies, which is important for information sharing. In regard to the latter, the access to generally high-quality intelligence and surveillance information is a great strength. This level of integration is a significant advantage which serves to optimise decision-making to maximise combat power. One difference is the US, as Peter's indicated, has geographic commands operating as essentially theatre commanders. The UK and Australia each have a joint operational headquarters from which deployed HQs and force packages are put together and then sent into theatre. Both the UK and Australia are used to integrating with the different US commands as operations dictate. The command and control in operations has been refined over the years and informed by periodic operations and changes in command and control technologies. A key weakness is that is being increasingly recognised is reliance on overt communications posture since the end of the Cold War. There is a heavy reliance on satellite communications. The means to undertake operations in a more covert manner is a work in progress, but probably will not and probably needs not return to the levels achieved in the coldest periods of the Cold War.
So we've talked a lot about AUKUS industrial base and development of AUKUS industrial base, but what of the Chinese industrial base? China's naval development, naval construction benefits from the fact that China is the world's largest producer of merchant ships. It now boasts 35% of the global share. Much of this construction is carried out at shipyards that also construct vessels for the PLA Navy. This is a reflection of China's conscious civil-military fusion strategy to promote greater innovation and integrated development in both sectors. For instance, the hull of China's recently launched third aircraft carrier, just launched, not commissioned, the Fujian, was constructed in the same dry dock at Jiangnan shipyard that had once just recently finished construction and assembly of the hull of an LNG-powered container vessel for export to France. Excuse me, to France. The Yangtze and Huangpu rivers in and around Shanghai bristle with shipbuilding. If you've been to Shanghai and seen the Huangpu and Yangtze river basins, shipbuilding is everywhere. Although China has numerous shipyards, there are more than 20 shipyards that construct vessels for the PLA Navy. I'd like to just touch on a few of the most important. First is the Jiangnan shipyard. It's on the Yangtze River near Shanghai, upriver from Shanghai. It's China's premier naval shipyard, boasting construction of the aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Recently, the Jiangnan yard was expanded by approximately 600 additional acres to handle construction of China's aircraft carriers and other vessels. Remember, I mentioned earlier that rapid expansion over this decade of the size of China's major combatants fleets. Next to Jiangnan is the Hudong Zhonghua shipyard, which has undergone recent expansion as well. Not surprisingly, that shipyard constructs commercial vessels, but also constructs the frigates and amphibious ships for the PLA Navy. Commercial and naval shipbuilding also occurs in the inland shipyard of Wuhan. The Wuhan Wuchang shipyard is about 500 miles, 800 kilometers upriver from Shanghai, and builds the Taibonan 3 Yuan class. This is a diesel submarine with air-independent propulsion, I think is what that stands for, AIP. AIP submarines. China's nuclear submarines, however, are built at the Bohai shipyard, the Huludao shipyard, which is on the northern coast of the Bohai Bay. Although this is China's only shipyard building nuclear submarines, it too was recently expanded to allow for stepped-up production. Open source estimates suggest that Huludao has the capacity to build up to 4 or 5 nuclear-powered submarines simultaneously. This includes both the SSNs and the soon-to-be updated SSBNs. However, whether the workforce, this is the key question, whether the workforce is sufficient to support such a build rate and whether China can develop a sufficient number of competent crew members for these remain open questions. Strengths, I would say, of the industrial base include one that's really important, I think, especially for the U.S. Navy, which has been requirements-based shipbuilding versus a legacy fleet that you have to adjust to new missions. We can talk about that later, or just I'll stay afterwards if you'd like. World's largest shipbuilding infrastructure obviously is a strength that the Chinese possess. A rapid production rate, top-level leadership support, that's huge. Crossover commercial production, which helps subsidize the Navy, and develops a skilled workforce. That's another strength. Centralized collection and dissemination of technology. I cannot overstate that, rather. Centralized collection and dissemination of the technology through industry consolidation rounds that have occurred over the last several years is a strength of China. I would also say the willingness to try new designs. What we've seen over the last 20, even 30 years is China's incremental changes to even similar platforms as they're developing them. China's willing to try something and see if it works and then include it, or if it doesn't work, discard it, but it has a lot of capacity for this sort of fail early, fail fast kind of approach. Weaknesses, I would say, include there is a single shipyard building nuclear-powered, I'm reaching here, single shipyard building nuclear-powered submarines. I think they have an immature long-endurance propulsion system in nuclear power, so that's going to be a weakness in what they're developing. Reliance on technology acquisition to some degree is rather than domestic development is something of a weakness. And immature acoustic quieting techniques in their submarines. These are some of the construction weaknesses that we see. I mentioned I'm reaching here. Building rates are something that I want to touch on too before I turn over the microphone. What's clear is that China's Navy is growing in both size and quality. That's what's clear. China's build rates are likely to increase over the course of this decade, as I mentioned, because of two decisions. The first is Chinese policymakers expanded the size of the shipyards, as I've described. And since China employs modern software and design practices and machinery and construction methods, once China's workforce is sufficiently increased in size and trained, the yard expansion should enable even more rapid production than what we have previously reported. Secretary Del Toro, Navy Secretary, has discussed this in some of his recent speeches. For instance, according to the Office of Naval Intelligence, since 2006, China has produced one nuclear submarine approximately every 15 months. But this was before the expansion of the Huludao shipyard, so the average build time will likely be further reduced. Similarly, even before it's expanding its shipyards, China built 30 Zhangkai-2 guided missile frigates in 11 years, or nearly 3 per year. So the second decision, and this had to do with this, a lot of the sharing that I mentioned earlier. The second decision was employing semi-modular construction. These techniques are being employed at the most advanced shipyards, and hull construction occurs in the scarce shed or dry dock space, while fitting out occurs pierside where space is more readily available. The result is shortened assembly times and increased throughput. I think, yeah. So here's a little bit of just a eye chart for you. You can see the numbers in 2000 in blue, 2010 in orange, 2020 in gray, and 2030 in gold there. And that helps give you a sense of the numerical growth over time. The total battle force size, as I mentioned earlier, in 2000 was 110 vessels, and by 2030 we expect 425. What a rapid expansion. So these figures demonstrate that the PLA Navy is, as I said, growing in both size and capability, but also that the force structure continues to emphasize regional sea control. What they're building emphasizes regional sea control. The PLA Navy will have increased power projection forces at its disposal, but as of 2030 cannot be counted as a true global power projection Navy unless they begin to develop this sort of basing system that I mentioned earlier. Admiral?
So now just to look at the AUKUS industrial support base. The US, and to a lesser extent its closest allies, has enjoyed a marked technological superiority in most spheres in maritime warfare since the later part of World War II. Only in some areas, such as missile technology, electronic warfare, did the Soviet Union challenge the West. Due to globalisation, technology change and industrial espionage, this advantage has dramatically changed. In respect to globalisation, there has been a dramatic offshoring of electronics manufacturing, including to China. A key building block for advanced and even domestic electronic systems, as we heard earlier today, is semiconductors. There are concentrated centres of production globally. For example, Taiwan produces 50%, the global supply, US 12%, and China 9%. As such, strengths and weaknesses in this area are difficult to delineate. The Australian Naval Institute's recent report on protecting Australian maritime trade shed some light on this, as did the Productivity Commission study on supply chains. In terms of warship construction, the US has a well-developed capability, but it is not at the same scale as it had been in the Cold War. It has also had a number of lacklustre programs, such as the Zumwalt class and the littoral combat ships, which have slowed fleet rejuvenation. In terms of production rates, it can produce 1 aircraft carrier every 5 years, 2 destroyers a year. From 2026, the reinitiated frigate program will deliver 3 frigates every 2 years, 1 or 2 nuclear attack submarines every year. Each boat takes just over 3 years to build. This is a finely tuned organisation with a seemingly limited capacity to expand in the short to medium term. As noted in a recent congressional report, there is potential to increase the US shipbuilding capacity, but it requires much better planning and a longer-term allocation of funding for industry to make the investment. In the UK, the key production rates are a frigate every 2 years and a nuclear submarine every 2 to 3 years. It takes 11 years to build an individual astute class. Australia, and just picking up from Joe Hockey's point, Australia's a bit of an outlier. If you looked at the table of the list of who buys more defence equipment from overseas in the world, we're rated typically number 3 or number 4. There's only 2 OECD countries in the top 10, Australia, and Japan is number 10. So it's a very unusual thing that we don't produce as much defence equipment as what we really should as an advanced economy. In Australia, a shipbuilding strategy, as we all know, is in place for a continuous production line of a destroyer or frigate-sized warship, and another is planned for the submarines. In addition, under the 2024 structure plan, there is for up to another 23 different classes of ship to be built over the next 20 years or more. So they can range from, a class of 1 to some smaller ones, but it's all totals up to about 23. One of the complications in delivering the capability is the absence of a well-founded Indigenous design capability, or even a partnership with an overseas design house for the major combatants. Arguably, this is required for at least those ships which are going to be part of that continuous build program, so that you can have a consistent approach to design, build philosophy, ship systems, and then you can actually start to accrue some benefits in terms of productivity, efficiency in build, and so on. So I liken it, it's a bit like we're asking the shipbuilding industry in Australia to build Kias, build 3 Kias, and then you're going to build Toyotas after that, and then you're going to change to Chevrolets. This situation not only impedes the efficiency of shipyards, but also brings with it a cost premium, and also impacts on the naval workforce, both in terms of training, but also the number of sailors you actually have to have because of that siloing. Over to you.
All right, so what are our overall judgments? The PLA Navy is a strong and lethal component of a larger joint system designed to establish sea control or sea denial within the first island chain. China's bases within the Spratly Islands and its future use of the Ream Naval Base in Cambodia provide the PLA Navy with favorable geographic strong points from which to support SLOC sea lines of operations security and influence regional political events in Southeast Asia. China's base in Djibouti is much less useful as a strong point to aid in sea lane security in a contested environment, but does assist the PLA Navy in conducting naval diplomacy throughout the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, and the Eastern Mediterranean regions when such operations are not contested by another major naval power. At any time, the PLA Navy could extend its reach into the Indian Ocean or the Central Pacific Ocean if it develops all-weather partnerships. But even additional access agreements in peacetime will provide the PLA Navy greater reach for its naval diplomacy with corresponding influence over regional events during peacetime. So the operational capabilities and operational efficiency strengths include sea denial within the first island chain, sea lane security within the first island chain, and global naval diplomacy. But the weaknesses are power projection beyond the first island chain, sea lane security beyond the first island chain, and seaborne second nuclear strike.
And just got one there of the amphibious
Oh, yeah.
guys. So just judgments on the overall AUKUS operational capability and effectiveness. The AUKUS maritime forces all have long put an emphasis on operational training and efficiency. They are all capable and well practiced in long deployments and operating in both open ocean and littoral waters. Like all forces, their strengths are often dictated by the nature of operations they have been assigned. For example, the demands of Arabian Gulf deployments at the turn of the century strengthened their littoral warfare credentials at the expense of blue water operations against a peer competitor. Indeed, the long period of post-Cold War operations led some of these skills and methods of operational training, but also analysis to atrophy. But this has been recognised. In the contemporary strategic environment, there is a need to conduct advanced maritime warfare in all 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions if you include cyber. There is also the aspect of ethos and experience. While it is approaching 20 years since the navies were in combat operations against an adversary navy, they all retain a corporate memory of conflict and how to effectively command and conduct maritime operations in war. This is a distinct advantage, particularly in the early phases of any conflict.
Well, on that cheery note, actually, we hope we've done a good job of assessing the strengths and weaknesses of each of the 2 naval systems, and that it has been as sobering to you as it has been to us as we developed it. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, gentlemen. The bad news is we don't have a ton of time left for questions. The good news is that was very thorough, and there might not be many questions left unanswered. So I'll take the opportunity to do one moderator question, and then we'll see what we have from the audience. As a ground-pounding cavalry scout from the U.S. Army, from a landlocked U.S. state who doesn't even swim very well, it was really helpful for me to understand the way that you approached an analysis of naval capabilities. And it makes sense that it's not just the arithmetic of numbers of ships or tonnage or anything like that, because clearly not all ships are created equal. More importantly, not all crews are created equal. That said, when we look at the assessment of the AUKUS countries, we did kind of treat it as arithmetic, right? It was US plus Australia plus UK equals AUKUS. But I wonder, is there any sense in which, well, and then, you know, if AUKUS adds nuclear submarines to the Australian side of that, then clearly it's an additive. But is there a sense in which AUKUS has the potential to be more than the sum of its parts, more than just US plus UK versus US? Or what is the intent of AUKUS for changing the maritime equation?
So I think a Marine Brigadier General just recently said that interoperability and the ability for allies to work together is asymmetric advantage. And I think anyone who's operated in a task group will know that a multinational task group is generally much more capable than one from a single service, because they just have a richer sense of capabilities that complement one another. It's going to be no different on a naval scale.
Yeah, I think China's fundamental approach to collective organizations is to attempt to divide them, right? Why? Because it is more than the sum of its parts. There's political pressure that China has to confront, you know, by having more people coalesced in opposition to expansionary aims. There's the potential economic cost as well of sort of collective action in response to any potential Chinese aggression. So those are just some, small points about the ways in which this is cooperation is magnifies. It's not just arithmetic.
Yeah, great. You used the word interoperability, sir, and that was brought up before. And in fact, we've heard in this forum and several others that we want to move beyond interoperability to true interchangeability. And you can understand the desirability of that. Does AUKUS, as constructed, that actually seems to be in tension, though, with another refrain that we heard today, which is that AUKUS isn't a mutual defense pact. It's not even a military alliance. It's a technological resource sharing, accelerator. So does AUKUS, in your mind, provide the opportunity to move beyond interoperability and toward interchangeability?
I think in many areas we're already there. So to give a case example, there's the US Navy Seahawk Romeo in Narrow being serviced. So they've already achieved that. All the different aspects of that Seahawk program is sort of emblematic of where we want to go in all sorts of areas. So so I think there's a lot of progress being made on these different fronts.
Okay, good. I would love to do one audience question, though it looks like Craig's going to give us the hook. We got
time for one, Rob.
time for one? Was that a hand up?
Yep. I think it'd be heard. Thanks for depressing us completely. So that's which is good, because it introduces a sense of realism to us. Fascinated by the fact that there's 150 unmanned vessels that are added to the US order of battle. Can you give us some idea about function and about the extent to which they actually can replace what we expect of manned vessels?
I think the best way to answer that, sir, is right now the U.S. Central Command, NAVCENT, Fifth Fleet, has been experimenting with using unmanned vessels for all sorts of missions, but in particular maritime domain awareness, ISR, and associated informational functions. We've already seen the ways in which unmanned vessels can deliver weapons. I mean, the Ukrainians just did it recently, apparently. But I think the way, my view is that what's going on in NAVCENT is worth paying careful attention to as sort of a hothouse of the future. Admiral Gilday, the Chief of Naval Operations, has used the fact that the United States has an opportunity to try out these vessels in the Central Command region as a way of testing out essentially what we talked about the Chinese doing, testing, trying different things, fail early, fail at a cheap cost, essentially. And so we're learning a lot rapidly about things like logistical support that unmanned vessels can provide, especially in contested environments, and the way that information and command and control can be facilitated with these vessels. That's probably about the boundaries of where I should go.
Kim, there's a really good report by the Congressional Research Service, which just came out a couple of weeks ago on the US unmanned vehicle program, and it's really recommended.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for sharing your deep information with us and depressing us, but making us all considerably smarter at the same time. Thank you.